talk about vision, envisioning. If you're going to be a leader, if you're going to be discipled into leadership, you've got to have vision. The Bible is clear. Where there's no vision, what happens? People perish. And none of us want the people to perish. That's totally against what we're called to do. So you've got to be a visionary, and we're going to talk about being a visionary. And then we're going to conclude the night talking about mentoring. We introduced that last month and said, things happen. Sometimes pastors leave. Sometimes they leave to go to another church. Sometimes they leave to go sell shoes or something. They just leave. Sometimes there's a warning. Sometimes there's not a warning. Pastors just leave. So what happens when the pastor leaves? Somebody's got to take over. Somebody's got to unlock the church next Sunday. Somebody's got to preach. So we're going to talk about how you mentor somebody so that if you leave or when you leave, there'll be somebody there to take over. And we're not trying to run anybody off. We're just saying when that happens, if that happens, and even if it doesn't, it wouldn't be a bad idea to mentor somebody. Just get them ready. Maybe they can go somewhere else and serve. So that's the way we're going to go at it tonight. So envisioning, in the 15th century, Spanish coins had an inscription on them. Just below the Straits of Gibraltar. I know you can't see the picture on the outline. I actually had a picture on the screen. But just below the Straits of Gibraltar was this inscription: Ne plus ultra. Nothing more beyond. That was the philosophy of the day. They believed that Spain was the edge of the earth. You sail west from Spain, you fall off the edge out there somewhere because the world was flat. And along came a guy named Columbus who had the audacity to be a visionary. And he said, I don't think the world is flat. I think you can sail west and end up in the east. And of course everybody thought he was crazy. But he did it. He sailed west, landed on the North American continent, proved that the world was not flat, it was in fact round. And the Spanish changed the inscription on their coins from Ne plus ultra to plus ultra, more beyond. Now the truth is, we all have those kinds of experiences, the Ne plus ultra and the plus ultra. We all have those kind of experiences that say, this is it. Sometimes we hit it on the high side and we say, it just doesn't get any better than this. Sometimes we hit it on the low side and we say, oh man, I don't see how in the world it could be worse. I don't know how it could get any worse than this. This is the lowest of the low. And so we say there's nothing more. One day the disciples came to a place like that. It was early in the ministry of Jesus. In fact, it shows up in the very first chapter of Mark. And everybody is looking for Jesus. In fact, he goes out early in the morning to pray, as was his custom. The disciples went out and found him. Pretty obvious they hadn't learned much yet. Went out and interrupted his prayer time to tell him that everybody's looking for you. Maybe they exaggerated a little. Maybe everybody was looking. Or maybe it just seemed like everybody was looking. But Lord, they're all looking for you. This is great. This is why we followed you. Lord, we can start a mega church. No, that's not what they said. That's what we would have said. You remember what Jesus said? Good. Let's go somewhere else. I mean, he could have stayed there. He was popular in Capernaum. People loved him. They came from everywhere to hear him speak. And he said, let's move on. Let's go somewhere else. That's why I came. Nothing more beyond. And yet, there was more beyond. Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. So let me tell you a real story. North of Los Angeles, there was a forest fire, and as they were cleaning up afterwards, they found a body, a man in a full scuba diving suit, burned to death. Why would a guy wear a scuba diving suit into a fire? And they finally concluded he was actually out in the ocean scuba diving when the helicopter scooped him up in the bucket, carried him over the fire and dumped him in, and he died in the fire. Pastor, one of these days, you're going to get dumped right in the middle of the fire. You may be ready and you may not. But you're going to get dropped right in the big middle of people who are hurting, of teenagers who are questioning life, of single adults who can't figure out why they're still single, of hurting parents, of senior adults who are asking, is that all there is? And you're going to get dropped right in the middle of that. And you better have some vision. You better know how to let God see you out of that. Otherwise, it'll eat you up. Future ingredients, well, let me go back up. I'm skipping around because I'm used to clicking and reading off the screen. So let me try to work off the outline and get it in some kind of order where you can follow. Glancing back, but not for long, Exodus 14 simply says that the danger of looking back is that we might decide to go back. And God is telling us to go forward. Vision always is in the future. Vision always leads us forward, not backward. There's a danger in Exodus 14. And the passage in Mark chapter 3 has Jesus putting the past, the present, and the future into perspective. So let's talk about some of the ingredients. Ingredients of successful vision. George Barna, actually let me quote somebody else. Robert Bella, an expert on civil religion. He was a sociologist. He taught at University of Southern California. Here's his statement: a society can be changed when 2% of its population has a new vision. Now think about that for a minute. A society can be changed when 2% of its population has a new vision. Have we seen that anywhere lately? Absolutely. Minorities, not racial minorities, but socioeconomic minorities, controlling everything. Now here's what happens. How many people do you have that show up every Sunday morning? Let's say 100. 2%. What's 2% of 100? 2. 2 people with a fresh vision can make a change in your church. Can I suggest that you be one of those 2? Otherwise, we may need to talk about how you mentor somebody to take over when you're gone. Because the 2% is going to help you move along. 2%. With a fresh vision. Doesn't have to be a godly vision, just a fresh vision, a new vision. And it can change society. So vision has to be leader initiated. And there's a difference in being a leader and being a manager. Managers have opinions. Leaders make decisions. There's a lot of difference. You got a church full of managers. They've got all kind of opinions. Everything from what you ought to preach to what color the carpet ought to be. But they're not going to make the decisions. You get to make those decisions. Ingredients of a successful vision. Leader initiated. Work within your limitations. If you're going to be a visionary leader, you have to learn to work within limitations. Do you remember what it was like to buy that first little box of whatever it was when you were growing up, Tinker Toys? You know, those things you put together. But you saw the picture on the box, you know. It was a monster truck, or it was a paddle wheel boat, or maybe a windmill. And for $1.98, you got the box. And you started putting it together, and you realized you need another box of some other things, like a motor that makes the wheels go around. Now you're limited. You got to either be excited about what you got, or you got to complain until you get more. And even when you get more, you find out that that $5.95 box goes with your $1.98 box, but there's a $19.95 box that has to go with that to make the whole thing work. Work within your limitations. Doesn't always work out the way you want it to, but you got to have the vision. You got to call the shots. So here's George Barna's quote: "To be an effective leader, you must be able to grasp God's vision, communicate it persuasively and compellingly, and establish that vision as the heartbeat of the congregation. A pastor who cannot accomplish this vital task will wind up being merely a caretaker who, for whatever reasons, is impeding the progress of the church." You've got to have the vision. Best if it comes from God. Work within the limitations. Be willing to go the extra mile. Do you have any second mile people in your church? I know who they are. They're your favorites. The second mile folks. You know, the ones that are always sticking around to see if you need anything else done before they go home. You know, that help you put the chairs up. The second mile people. Favorites. Zig Ziglar talks about those second mile folks. And I'm going to find that quote somewhere. Or maybe I'm not going to find it somewhere. Here it is. There are no traffic jams in the extra mile. It's not crowded there. Those second mile people have lots of space around them because you don't have a lot of those folks. Willing to go the extra mile. Understanding God's resources. You ever just stop to think how much resource God has for you? I know sometimes pastors get to thinking, I'm in this thing by myself. I don't know if I can make this work or not. And that's when you need to stop and catch yourself and think about God's resources. What all does God have to offer you? Resources. A successful leader is going to work within the team and the congregation. We looked at that last month. You remember we talked about those disciples? We were talking about how you ought to love one another. And you get to looking at those disciples and you've got Simon Peter, loud, maybe a bit obnoxious. Every time Jesus asked a question, Peter answered. How long would it take for that to get old in a group of 12? And John, a philosopher. You know any philosophers? One of the great things about being on the seminary faculty is going to the faculty lounge and sitting around with a bunch of people who don't think like you do. Then the philosophy of religion professors come in and everything falls apart. They're not even sure they're in a faculty lounge. John was a philosopher. If Jesus said something, John, go sit under a tree and think about it for 2 weeks. And John and Peter worked side by side within the group of disciples. Andrew, a man of untroubled faith. Loosely translated, that's gullible. Andrew believed everything. Jesus said it, Andrew's ready. Thomas, the doubter. Thomas, guess what? The Lord's alive. Oh, yeah? Let me see the nail print in his hand. Doubting Thomas. And Andrew, a man of untroubled faith. And those two worked together. Simon the Zealot. You know who the Zealots were? A religious/political party whose purpose was the overthrow of the Roman government. And Matthew, the tax collector. That's about as government as you could get. And they worked together. And the reason they all worked together was they stopped looking at each other and looked together at Jesus. And a visionary pastor will lead his congregation to look together at Jesus instead of looking at each other. Because Paul said it, we are many, and we have differing gifts. The visionary pastor will somehow be able to pull those gifts together and work within the team, within the congregation. And then mentoring. That's what we've come to, mentoring. So let me get to it. Second Timothy 2:2. Again, why would we talk about mentoring? Because it's a part of being a leader. To be able to train someone else, to mentor someone, whether you're mentoring that someone to replace you or whether you're just mentoring them because God says, take this person under your wing and help them, mentor them. 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul is writing, by the way, to the young man he's mentoring. The things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So where did we get mentoring? In the early years, it was the chief learning method in society, where one person took another person and taught them how to do something. It was the way of learning. It was the way people moved from one generation to the next. Mothers taught their daughters how to cook. Fathers taught their sons how to hunt. It's the way things worked. In Christian ministry, mentoring centers on Jesus and develops God-given resources. So what kind of mentoring are we talking about? There are lots of different kinds. You can be a discipling mentor, meaning the disciple person is a learner. You are a discipler. You are helping them learn the basic things about God. You're making disciples. There's the accountability partner kind of mentor. For a number of years, I had sometimes 6, sometimes 8 students that would meet in my office on Wednesday at noon for 1 hour, bring your lunch, eat in the office, and we held each other accountable. We prayed, but mostly we shared. And every group was different, every semester, a different group. And they had to set up their own 10 accountability questions to hold each other accountable for one semester. And the rule was you could call anybody in that group at any hour of the day or night and ask any one of those 10 questions. It's an accountability kind of thing. It's a mentoring process. You're helping each other by holding them accountable. So the questions ran the gamut. Have you told your wife this week that you love her? Wow. Have you tithed this week? It's kind of personal. When was the last time you told someone about Jesus? Those are the kind of questions they ask each other, day and night. And to make it work, I had to be one of the team. So they could call and ask me any question on that list anyway, also. So I made sure I told my wife I loved her every week. Because one of these knuckleheads is going to call me and ask me that. There's the coach kind of mentor. You know what a coach does? A coach corrects you. Whether they're coaching you how to play the piano or how to play third base. You know, they're showing you what you've done wrong. They're helping you do it right. Coaching you along toward whatever your team's trying to accomplish. There's the counselor. The counselors advise people. There's the teacher kind of mentor who shares knowledge with you. And there's the sponsor kind of mentor that develops your career. Now here's the good news. To be a pastor mentor, you get to do all of those. And you are expected to do all of those. At some point in time, all of those are required of you. Half of the churches in America are experiencing a conflict right now. One half. Statistics show. Well, I hope you're in the other half. But if you're in the half that somewhere in the congregation there's a conflict, you better get to mentoring somebody to help you make the right decisions at the right time. And there's some biblical role models. I don't think we'll go into all of those, but there they are: Moses and Joshua, Elijah and Elisha, Barnabas and Paul, Jethro and Moses, Barnabas and John Mark. I like that one. John Mark got kicked off the team. Paul said, I can't use him. But good old Barnabas saw something in John Mark that Paul didn't see. And you'll see some things in some of your church members that other church members don't see. And Barnabas mentored John Mark. And then you remember how that story ended. Paul's in prison. He says, somebody get Mark. He can be a benefit to me now. Bring him to me. Paul and Timothy, that's the big one. Everybody knows about Paul and Timothy. We went through a phase, a long time ago, 25 years ago maybe, where everybody was supposed to have a Paul and everybody was supposed to have a Timothy. You were supposed to mentor somebody and be mentored by somebody else, and that kind of ran its course, but it was a good thing. It helped us learn how to train others and how to be subject to training ourselves. And then the kind of mentoring that Paul did with church members through letters. Galatians 4:12, brethren, I urge you. Have you seen this verse? Brethren, I urge you, be like me. Can you imagine saying that in the pulpit next Sunday morning? Now, folks, all I really want you to do is be like me. Buy your ticket early. But you see, what Paul was doing was saying, if you can't be like Jesus, and it looks like you can't, at least be like me. You'll be one step closer to being like Jesus. Now, that works. And if you explain it, you might get away with it next Sunday morning. But you probably ought not try it. And then there's the mentoring of Jesus and the disciples. Dedicated most of his ministry to that. Mark 3:14, he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. That's the idea. You get one or two or three and you let them hang out with you. So they can learn from you, so you can mentor them, and so they can begin to do the ministry. So let me tell you how I did it. There were two programs that I was responsible for at Southwestern Seminary, in addition to teaching in the classroom. I took over a program that sent young wannabe preachers out during spring break to preach revival meetings in small churches outside the Bible Belt. Little bitty churches that didn't have money to have a preacher come and preach a revival meeting. I'm talking about churches of 10, 12. And we had a school full of preachers that wanted to preach. They didn't have any experience. Maybe they got to preach once at their home church before they went off to seminary. Maybe they preached at the nursing home. That's usually a first stop along the way. But they didn't have much experience, and few of them had ever preached a revival meeting. My job was to recruit them, 100, 150 of them every semester. Teach them how to do it, buy a plane ticket and send them on their way. And when they came back, to hear their stories and to rejoice with those that rejoiced and weep with those that weep, and they were both. And then the other program was an urban practicum that took a small group, maybe 10 students, to an urban area to spend a week and to study urban ministry. And we went to places like Houston. That was easy and inexpensive. Chicago, Eastern Seaboard, Southern California, Seattle, Vancouver, Denver, South Florida. And we learned. And the dean called me in one day and he said, "You know, you're not going to live forever." I said, "No." "Really?" He said, "Don't make fun of me." I said, "Well, so what?" "Well, we need to get somebody to replace you." I said, "I hadn't planned on going anywhere." He said, "Well, I mean, when you leave, you need to start training somebody to do these 2 programs." "Okay. Any ideas?" He said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." He says, "Dr. So-and-so, you can train him." So he and I went through it for 1 year. I told him everything I knew. He tried to learn from me. At the end of the year, they fired him. So I guess I didn't do a very good job. Or maybe he couldn't learn. I don't know. He got fired. But I was trying to mentor somebody to take over because I wasn't going to live forever. That's 15 years ago, by the way. I've retired twice since then. Still not going to live forever. And then there was the mentoring that took place in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, where for 16 years I took 10 students every spring, and we spent a week studying New Age and postmodern and all those kind of things. And what's it like to try to start a church and grow a church in a culture like that? 3 million people. Second most expensive city in the world, second only to Sydney, Australia. How do you live in a city where a 1-bedroom, 1-bath house with no yard and no garage costs $1 million? That's tough. How do you start a church where there aren't any Christians to start with? Less than 2% of the population of Vancouver would be in any kind of worship service on a given weekend. It's the second largest Chinese city in the world. Second largest Indian city in the world. 2/3 of the population speak a language other than English when they go home in the evening. How do you work with people like that? And yet after 16 years of taking 10 students every year, there were 18 of them back up there starting churches. They figured it out, said you tithe, you bring 10, you leave 1. Well, they didn't leave any, but some of them went back and finished and moved. And then I retired. No thanks to the dean, I retired when I wanted to, but I retired. And these guys in Vancouver said, "Hey, you can't leave us up here. You can retire from the faculty at the seminary, but you can't leave us. So we added you to the associational staff." "Oh, really?" "Yeah, well, don't worry, we're not going to pay you." I've got another job like that, Robert. Reminds me of this job. They said, "You got to keep coming back." So they gave me some kind of title. I don't even remember what it was now. It had mentor in the word, in the title. So I went back 6 times a year, every other month, spend a week, Have breakfast with one of them, coffee with another one, lunch with another one, coffee in the afternoon with another one, dinner with another one, and you do that the next day and every day that week. And I asked them 4 questions. And these are pretty good. You can do this. In fact, if I were coming back, well, let's say next week, and you and I were going to lunch, and I was mentoring you, these are the 4 questions I would ask you. And they wouldn't come 1, 2, 3, 4. We might take an hour and a half to eat lunch, and somewhere in there I'd get all 4 of them. How are you doing? Question number 1. How are you doing? And that goes lots of directions. Physical, health-wise, financially. You know how hard it is to raise your own salary in a place like Vancouver? Where none of your new converts, you start a church and all these people are new believers. You don't preach on tithing the second Sunday. They don't want to know about that yet. We spring that on them later. So where are you going to get any money? Nobody pays you. You're not an International Mission Board missionary. You're not a North American Mission Board. You're up there on your own. You got to raise your own money. You know how hard it is to come back south and tell your home church, I'm living in $1 million home. This is what it cost me. Oh, by the way, it's only 1 bedroom, 1 bath, no yard, no garage. And I really need, and they'll quote some outrageous figure, and folks in the South say, you can join our staff. We can pay you that much right here. You don't need to go back to Vancouver. It's tough. How are you doing could be financial, could be family-wise. How are you doing? Second question, what are you doing? Now we're getting personal. What are you doing? And we may have to talk about that for 30 minutes or so. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me what's working and what's not working. And it's okay to admit that something didn't work if you tried and it didn't work. And it may not work just because the guy down the street had it work for him. Just tell me what you're doing. What are you doing? Third question was, what do you need? That's where it gets fun. A guy named Jerry Connor had started a church. It grew a little bit. He said, nobody in my church brings a Bible with them. They don't own a Bible. And so what do you need? He said, I need pew Bibles. How much do those cost? Well, we've got them in Canada. They cost a fortune. So buy them somewhere in the South and take them up there in my luggage. How many you need? About 50. Well, can't get those in my luggage. So I wrote a bunch of churches. I have a friend in Vancouver who needs some pew Bibles. They cost $50 each. How many would you like to buy for him? I had about 6 churches that bought all of them, each. I mean, all of a sudden, he had enough money to stock the Coliseum with pew Bibles. So what am I going to do with all these Bibles? I said, you're going to put enough tags in the front that represents all of those churches, so when they show up, you can show them the Bibles and say, see, we got it with your money. But you don't send any of it back. You put it into the ministry. But that's what he needed. Can you imagine what it would be like on Sunday morning to ask people to turn to whatever, and nobody's got a Bible? Well, some of you may know, yeah. That's what it's like in my church. Well, I met a need. And then there's Suzanne Perry. Suzanne was my grader her last year at seminary. She went with me to Vancouver. Before that last year, I kind of mentored her along, although I'm not too big on men mentoring women. But she was a seminary student. She was my grader. And she had responded to God's call to international missions. And every time she talked to the International Mission Board, they said, well, where do you think God's calling you? And she said, everywhere. No. Which people group do you think you want to work with? And she said, all of them. They said, well, we can't send you. Obviously, God's not speaking to you, or he'd give you something specific. She said, well, he hadn't. So she goes to Vancouver. Guess who lives there? Everybody. She spent a week there, and she said, I think this is where God's called me. University of British Columbia, 65,000 students. There are 196 nations in the world, and 160 of them are enrolled in that school. You want to make disciples of all nations? I got a place you can go. And you don't have to move around much. You can just go to one campus, and you can pretty well make disciples of all nations. You'll have to eat peanut butter and jelly, but you can do it. 15 years she was there without a vehicle. 15 years this single woman rode city buses everywhere she needed to go. So when I retired last November from that job, I said, I got one more thing I need to do. I need to get Suzanne a car. I didn't know how I was going to do that, but I knew I needed to do it because I'd been mentoring her all these years, every other month, going through these questions with her, being there when she had major surgery because her daddy couldn't get there, you know, all those kind of things. I got to get her a car. I have a mechanic who was one of my former students. Some of my former students really excel in life, you know, and become a mechanic. But that's what God told him to do, so he did it. So I went to see him and I said, I know sometimes people bring cars by and when you fix it, they can't afford to pay for it. And then you're stuck with it. He said, yeah, usually I got one on the lot all the time. I said, I need that one. I need to take it to Vancouver. The next time you get one you can't get rid of, I need to get it to Vancouver. Okay. That went on for 48 hours until he called me 2 days later and said, I think I have you a car. He said, a guy walked in that's been a customer of mine for years. He threw a set of keys on the desk and he says, give this car to somebody. And when they try to pay for it, tell them Merry Christmas. He said, do you think Suzanne could use a Toyota? Yeah, I believe she could. So then we started trying to figure out how we're going to get it up there. It cost a fortune. You got to export it from the United States and then import it into Canada. And they get to name the price for the importing. So it could cost a lot of money. Finally, Suzanne said, why don't you sell it and just give me the money and I'll buy one up here. Because after all, if you work on a campus, and by the way, she's the Southern Baptist chaplain at the University of British Columbia. If you work on a campus, they're always selling cars on campus. So I put a little note on Facebook, said I'm trying to get rid of a car. A friend said, I've got a friend looking for a car, and the next thing I know, I'd sold it. And then I raised some more money, just saying, anybody want to pitch in on this? And Canadian-wise, she got $20,000 to buy a new car. That's how you mentor somebody. What do you need? I need a car. Well, I don't know how to do that, but God does, so let's go to work on it. The last question is, how can I help? And they usually try to get real spiritual on that one. Well, you can pray for me. Well, I already do that, so give me something new. How can I help you? And it's amazing what they come up with. Well, next time you come, and they'll name their favorite food. You know, could you smuggle that in here? You think you could buy me a tank of gas? Gasoline costs $8 a gallon in Vancouver. How can I help? So that's an example. That's what I did with 18 or so former students who I was somewhat responsible for in them being in Vancouver in the first place. And them saying, you can't leave us here, you got to stay with us. And I stayed with them. And by the way, I didn't leave them all up there in November. COVID did them in. You try to raise money from churches during COVID, and you know what churches do when COVID hits and people stop giving. What do we cut? We can't cut salaries, we can't cut expenses, we can't cut utilities, we can't cut insurance. What do we cut? We cut missions. So they lost money, and they finally got to the point where they couldn't afford to stay. So most of them had to come back to the States. So that's my testimony of how I did it. Now, some suggestions strategy-wise. What can you do? How can you mentor someone? Well, let's look at some possibilities. Visitation. We still do that? You got to go visit somebody. Don't go by yourself. Take somebody with you. You don't have to say a word. Just let them watch. They'll catch it. You got to go by the hospital to visit somebody having surgery next week. Take somebody with you. They don't have to do anything. Just take them along. Let them watch. Counseling. Well, that gets a little personal. You have to be careful with that, but there are some situations where you could actually have somebody sitting by you as you counsel with somebody, especially if you guys are trying to counsel with a single woman. Wouldn't hurt to have a guy sitting by you. Don't ever close the door unless you have a window in it. We had a little problem with seminary. We built a new prayer room, put a door in it, and I said, we're going to put a window in the door, and the president's wife said, no, we're not. This is private. This is a private prayer room. You don't want to put a window in the door. I said, all right, do it your way. After the campus security guards called about the 10th time, finding students in the prayer room in positions that are not in the Bible as prayer positions, she said, we need a window in the door. That's a good idea. Always let it be somebody else's idea. All the ideas don't have to be yours, okay? My dad was a successful pastor, and the last church he pastored was in deep East Texas, one of those traditional deep East Texas churches with lots of steps going up to the auditorium. And there were increasing numbers of elderly women in the church who could not maneuver those steps. And he said, we really need an elevator. But he knew his deacons, and he knew there was no way in the world he was going to get an elevator put in that church. So he just started dropping hints at the coffee shop or wherever, Where's Miss So-and-so? I hadn't seen her in a long time. Oh, well, Pastor, she's got arthritis. Well, I wonder how we could get her to church. Well, he just kept dropping hints. One night in the deacons meeting, one of the deacons said, you know what we really need? We need an elevator. And my dad said, that is a good idea. Let it be his idea. And they got an elevator. He knew how to mentor his deacons. Let them have all the ideas. They like it better that way. Teaching, pretty obvious. Sermon preparation and preaching. Do you have people in your church who can preach when you don't? It's pretty simple to teach them how. Can I teach you how real quick? This is Dr. Dan's simple sermon suggestions. You got your text, 1 verse, 3 verses, whatever it is, a story, a miracle, something. You've got your text. What are you going to do? You're going to explain it. You got explanation, application, illustration. Got it? What it says, what it means, and what it looks like. That's all there is. That's sermon preparation. And you may have one point in a sermon. You may have 2 or 3, or you may have a pointless sermon. I've heard some of those. But however many there are, whether you call them points or bullets or ideas or whatever you want to call them, you divide it up, and then you've got these 3 things. What does it say? What does that mean? What does it look like? That's your illustration. So you can't just spend 30 minutes or 45 minutes or however long you preach doing explanation. If all you're doing is telling them what it says, what are you going to do when you get to passage like greet one another with a holy kiss? Uh-oh. Now teenagers are going to be happy. They're going to like that part. Wash one another's feet. Oh. We got Baptists that wash their feet, and we got Baptists that don't ever wash their feet. But, you can't preach on that. Judas went out and hanged himself. Okay. What do I do with that? You can't just explain. So you got to apply. What does that mean? In cultures, many cultures in the world, they greeted each other with a holy kiss. I was told before going into Ukraine, when you get through preaching, the pastor will come up and kiss you. I said, I just changed my vote for women pastors. I don't think I wanted to do that. Y'all know who Rick Warren is? Yes, we do. Rick's a pretty popular guy. He sat in class one time for me. Saddleback Church, California. He said recently that he was adding more and more application to his sermons and less explanation. Because he said more than what it says, people want to know, what does that mean? And he talked about the what and the so what. You tell them what it says, and then you tell them, so what? What am I going to do about it? If your people are leaving on Sunday morning and they don't know what to do, then you haven't finished preaching yet. Illustrations, what does it look like? What does it say? What does it mean? What does it look like? Those are hard to come up with, illustrations. But you got to use them. People love them. They'll tune back in when you get to an illustration. Just like you've done tonight. I'm teaching and I'm watching you, and when I say, you're back with me. Because I'm saying something personal. Now don't overload your sermons with personal stuff. They'll think you're an egotist. But one good personal illustration is not bad. You'll gain your audience back. So teach somebody how to preach, and teach them that they've got 30 seconds to get the attention of their audience. And if they don't get the attention of their audience in 30 seconds, it's uphill the rest of the way. Something catches them. And then go with it. Well, that's extra. And just pay me for that. Crisis ministry? Absolutely. You get a call in the middle of the night, you need to have 2 or 3 people that you can call in the middle of the night. Say, I got to go out here on the highway, so-and-so's had a wreck. I'll be by to pick you up. Crisis ministry. Don't tell them how to do it, show them how to do it. Decision making. Difference in decisions and opinions. We talked about that earlier. This person you're mentoring needs to know from you that they're going to get criticized just like you get criticized. I just don't care how good a pastor you are. There are people in your congregation that couldn't throw a taco across the table. I changed that from biscuit across the breakfast table because I thought it would play better. It didn't. Bad illustration. They don't know enough to criticize you, but they do it anyway. It's part of being a pastor. Get used to it. And if you're mentoring somebody, let them in on it. They don't all like you all the time. Some people are going to be upset with you. Working with people, yeah. Resources, calendar planning. Okay, I'm going to quit preaching and start meddling right here. Long-range calendar planning versus manana. Seriously, folks, some things you got to plan down the line. You can't wait till tomorrow to plan tomorrow. You got to plan tomorrow tonight. You got to think ahead and plan ahead. And as you mentor this person that's going to take over when you disappear, they need to know how to look ahead and plan ahead and think ahead. So those are just suggestions. How long are you going to mentor somebody? The answer reminds me of the preaching professor, a friend of mine, who said a student asked him, how long is a good sermon? And he said, as long as you need to take, and no more. How long are you going to mentor this guy? As long as it's needed, and no more. Don't wear him out. Just get him ready. It's not that hard. Not that hard to mentor. I've given you recommended books, 5 of them, in fact, on mentoring. You can go from there. You can read a little more. But your vision, whether you're leading as a visionary or leading someone else to be a visionary, has to keep focused. And the only way you can keep your vision sharp and focused is to keep going to the doctor, the eye doctor, the great physician doctor. And that's the only way I can keep these glasses focused. Every so often I got to go, and she'll take them off and, make me read that poster. Well, what'd you take them off for? I can't even see the wall without them. We got to read these letters, read these numbers, all this stuff they do in there. And then I get a new prescription. Now I can see better. You got to do that spiritually. So I'm going to close with a letter to an insurance company. Some of you probably heard this. It has to do with doing the job alone, which you can't do. Dear Sir, I'm writing in response to your request for additional information. In Block 3 of the accident report, I put trying to do the job alone as the cause of my accident. In your letter, you said that I should explain more fully, and I trust that the following details will be sufficient. I'm a bricklayer by trade. On the date of the accident, I was working alone on the roof of a 6-story building. When I completed my work, I discovered I had about 500 pounds of brick left over. Rather than carry the bricks down by hand, I decided to lower them in a barrel by using a pulley that was fortunately attached to the side of the building at the 6th floor. Securing the rope at ground level, I went up to the roof, swung the barrel out, and loaded the bricks into it. Then I went back to the ground and untied the rope, while holding the rope tightly to ensure a slow descent of the 500 pounds. You will note in Block 2 of the accident report form that I stated my weight was 135 pounds. Due to my surprise at being jerked off the ground so suddenly, I lost my presence of mind and forgot to let go of the rope. Needless to say, I proceeded at a rather rapid rate up the side of the building. In the vicinity of the 3rd floor, I met the barrel coming down. This explains the fractured skull and broken collarbone. Slowed down only slightly, I continued my rapid ascent, not stopping until my right hand was 2 knuckles deep into the pulley. Fortunately, I regained my presence of mind and was able to hold tightly to the rope in spite of my pain. At approximately the same time, however, the barrel of bricks hit the ground and the bottom fell out of the barrel. Devoid of the weight of the bricks, the barrel now weighing approximately 50 pounds. I refer you again to my weight in Block 2. As you might imagine, I began a rather rapid descent down the side of the building. In the vicinity of the 3rd floor, I again met the barrel coming up. This accounts for my 2 fractured ankles and the lacerations of my legs and lower body. This encounter with the barrel slowed me enough to lessen my injuries when I fell into the pile of bricks. Fortunately, only 3 vertebrae were cracked. Sorry to report, however, that as I lay on the bricks in pain, unable to stand, watching the empty barrel 6 stories above, I again lost my presence of mind and let go of the rope. The empty barrel weighed more than the rope, so it came back down and broke both of my legs. I hope I furnished the information that you require as to how the accident occurred, because I was trying to do the job alone. Don't even try to do the job alone. Can't do it. God didn't call you to do it alone. Be a visionary, but help somebody else catch it. Then if you do leave, or die, or slip out of town in the cover of darkness, somebody will take over. The church won't die. So get somebody ready.